We think we understand ancient warfare. Bronze becomes iron, empires rise, soldiers march, and technology evolves in a neat, straight line. But the ground keeps proving something else. Again and again, archaeologists pull up objects that feel out of place for their time. Body armor built like a bronze machine, royal cuirasses stitched with symbols of power, shields painted with myths on the edge of an empire, and armies sculpted for the dead, as if war itself had to continue beyond the grave. These are not just weapons or protection, they are statements, warnings, propaganda, sometimes offerings. Tonight, we follow 8 artifacts across 3,000 years, from tombs and bogs to ruined forts and riverbeds, to find what they were really built to say. If you picture Bronze Age Greece, you probably imagine spears, shields, and a warrior wearing little more than a helmet and courage. That image survives because it feels believable. It matches our assumptions about early technology. But in the Argolis region, outside a quiet village called Dendra, the earth delivered something that did not match the story at all. This was not a single breastplate, not a broken helmet, not a fragment of a weapon. It was something far more unsettling. A complete concept. In May 1960, Swedish archaeologists excavating the Dendra site uncovered bronze plates dating to the 15th century BC. And once the pieces were understood together, they formed what can only be described as a full-body suit of armor, a panoply, a Bronze Age exoskeleton. 15 pieces in total: bronze breastplate and backplate, large shoulder guards, plates for the armpits, a neck protector, curved shields hanging from the waist to guard the groin and thighs, even evidence of additional protections for arms and legs. And the more you look at it, the more it feels like it should belong to a much later world. Because this is not primitive improvisation. This is engineering. The breastplate and backplate are connected by a hinge on the left side, turning the torso into something that opens and closes like a mechanism. Leather lacing held the components together, not for decoration, but to allow the entire suit to flex and breathe with the movement of the warrior. That detail matters, because the first question people ask is simple: could someone even move in this? The answer is complicated. The armor forms a heavy tubular suit and covers almost the entire body. It looks like something designed for maximum protection. But the bronze plates are also loosely fastened with leather strips, suggesting the designers were balancing rigidity and movement. This is where the story becomes larger than one artifact, because the Mycenaean world was not a collection of isolated villages. The era, roughly 1600 to 1100 BC, was the phase where Greek society surged into something structured and powerful. Palace states, trade routes, hierarchical systems, writing, art, planning. War evolves in those conditions, not only in weapons, but in organization. And that means an elite warrior class, the kind of class that would demand and could afford a suit like this. Written evidence suggests similar armors existed in places like Knossos, Pylos, and Tiryns, but the Dendra Panoply is the oldest physical example ever unearthed. It is the oldest full-body armor in Greece that we can actually point to and say, it was real. And inside the same tomb, archaeologists also found slivers of boar's tusk, pieces from a boar's tusk helmet, another elite item. So the panoply was not alone. It belonged to a warrior identity. Now step back and consider what that means. A Bronze Age warrior, sealed in a tomb, outfitted like a moving fortress. This is not merely protection. It is status. It is a message to the living and to the dead. This person mattered. This person was dangerous. This person was part of a system that understood war as something more than a chaotic clash. And the location matters too. Dendra's history reaches back into the early Bronze Age. Excavations began when Swedish archaeologist Axel Persson identified a cemetery filled with chamber tombs and beehive tombs. Some earlier burials even contained the remains of sacrificed horses. So Dendra is not a random dot on a map. It is a place where power was buried and remembered. Today, the Dendra Panoply sits on display at the Archaeological Museum in Nafplio. Behind glass, under careful lighting, it looks silent. But it is not silent, because it asks a question that never fully goes away. If this is what the Mycenaeans could build in the 15th century BC, what else did they build that never survived? And what kind of battlefield demanded a suit like this? If the Dendra Panoply is the Bronze Age shouting, Philip II's armor is the classical world whispering something colder. Power is personal. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, was not just a king, he was a machine of reform. He reshaped the Macedonian army, forged the foundations of an empire, and changed how war was fought in Greece. But when he died in 336 BC, his story did not end in a battlefield. It ended in a tomb. Under the great tumulus at Vergina, Tomb 2 remained unplundered, sealed through centuries, waiting. In 1977, archaeologist Manlis Andronikos opened it, and the world watched. What emerged was not only treasure, but an identity. Among the grave goods was a suit of armor so distinctive that it seemed to match ancient descriptions of the king's body, a cuirass. Not the standard image of a soldier's gear, a royal thorax, designed to resemble the structure of a linothorax, but made in iron, in 7 anatomical plates connected by hinges. A hard shell shaped around a short, rounded torso. Not generic, not interchangeable. A suit that appears designed for one wearer. That's where the story deepens, because armor is usually practical. It is built to fit a class of men. But this armor feels like it was built to fit a single history. The shoulder flaps, the appomedes, fold and latch, covering neck areas. Bronze hinges connect plates, and lion-shaped rings are riveted at key points. Purple leather embellishes the rims. Decorative bands carry embossed ornaments. The royal sun emblem of Vergina appears on the front in silk. Even the inner surfaces were padded with wool and silk. That detail is revealing, because it suggests this was not only battle gear, it was ceremonial. It was political theater. A king does not simply wear armor. A king wears meaning. After the ceremonial cremation, the armor was placed in the main chamber next to the golden funeral box, meant to accompany Philip into the afterlife. Not because he would literally fight there, but because the image of Philip as warrior had to survive death. And this is something we underestimate about ancient power. Rulers did not just control land, they controlled stories. A cuirass like this is a story you can touch. Look at the decorations. Athena embossed on a side plate, floral silk copied from the funeral box, stylized lions, blossom patterns on the back. This is art used as authority. Even the terrages, rows of leather strips attached at the rim, offered movement and protection while enhancing the silhouette of a heroic warrior. And the greaves found nearby, recreated using traditional techniques, complete the image. The suit gives a glimpse into the luxury of Macedonian royalty, but it also reveals something else. A kingdom that understood war as an extension of identity. Because Philip's innovations, including the phalanx reforms and strategic consolidation, were not just tactics. They were the blueprint for Alexander's future world. So when you stand before this armor today in the museum at Aigai, you are not looking at metal. You are looking at a bridge between father and son, between Macedonia and empire. And the question becomes unavoidable. Did Philip's armor protect him, or did it protect the myth of him? Because the most powerful thing a king can leave behind is not a weapon. It is a narrative that outlives the grave. Rome left stone everywhere. Roads that still cut across mountains, forts that still cast shadows, inscriptions that still name the dead. But there is one Roman object that should have survived in huge numbers, and yet almost never does: the legionary shield. The scutum is one of the most recognizable silhouettes in military history. Curved, tall, rectangular. It appears in carvings, reliefs, coins, and paintings of Roman battles. It is described by ancient authors as if it was as common as a sword. Yet for centuries, archaeology could not give us the one thing we wanted most: a real one. Because the scutum was mostly organic: wood, glue, canvas, leather, paint, the kind of materials that rot, crack, and vanish long before anyone can collect them. So historians built the Roman soldier from fragments: metal bosses, nails, shield edges, artistic depictions, and second-hand descriptions. Then, on the far eastern edge of the Roman world, in a city that died violently and was never rebuilt, the ground kept what time usually destroys: Dura-Europos. Dura-Europos sat above the Euphrates in what is now Syria, a frontier place shaped by empires. It began as a Hellenistic settlement, shifted under different rulers, and eventually became a Roman garrison town. Frontier cities like this are never peaceful for long. They live in tension. They absorb cultures, languages, and soldiers from far away, because empires use the edges of their world as shields. By the mid-3rd century CE, Dura-Europos faced a siege that would end everything. In 256 CE, Sassanid Persian forces attacked. The city fought back. Rome reinforced its western wall, turning adjacent buildings into part of the defense. Towers were strengthened, corridors sealed, earth piled, and anything that could slow an enemy was used. The battle was not just above ground, it went underground too, because the Persians dug. So the Romans dug back. Excavations later revealed a counter-tunnel where Roman soldiers likely faced suffocation and fire. The details are still debated, but the core reality is clear. Men died in darkness beneath the wall, in cramped air, where panic is faster than steel. And somewhere in that chaos, equipment was left behind. A scutum. Not displayed, not preserved intentionally, not treated as sacred, just part of a soldier's life, used until it wasn't. The shield ended up sealed within the defensive works, buried in collapsed material, starved of oxygen, protected by the very disaster that destroyed the city. That is the first irony. The shield survived because the city didn't. During excavations in the 1930s, archaeologists uncovered the shield in a flattened, damaged state, broken into fragments. Its central boss, the umbo, was missing. That missing boss matters because the umbo was the protective dome of metal placed over the hand grip area, meant to deflect blows and protect the hand. Without it, you feel the vulnerability of the shield's skeleton. But even damaged, it was extraordinary. Because this was not just any Roman shield board. This was the only surviving example of the distinctive semi-cylindrical legionary scutum in something close to its full form. Something you could measure, reconstruct, and study, not just imagine. The excavation team carefully reconstructed it, piecing together what time and pressure had broken. And then, something even more rare appeared. Paint, decoration, symbol. Roman military gear is often imagined as plain, purely functional. But the Dura scutum carries imagery that speaks with the voice of an empire. An eagle, a laurel wreath, winged figures of victory, a lion. These are not random decorations. They are psychological architecture. They are identity, applied to equipment so that the soldier carries Rome's message in his hands. Imagine what that means in a place like Dura-Europos, a garrison town filled with outsiders and locals, Greek speakers and Aramaic speakers, Roman troops and auxiliary units, merchants, soldiers' families, servants, craftsmen, and dependents. A city within a city, where military life reshaped daily life. In an environment like that, symbols become weapons. They remind the soldier who he is supposed to be, and they remind everyone else who owns the walls. And then there's the construction. This shield was not a single chunk of wood. It was engineered. Thin wooden strips were layered in plies. The layers crossed grain directions to create strength while keeping weight manageable. The final thickness was surprisingly slim, yet resilient. This design is exactly what makes the SCUTUM so terrifying in formation warfare. Not because it is heavy, but because it is efficient. You can carry it all day. You can lift it overhead. You can lock it against other shields. And that leads to the tactic the SCUTUM was built for, the testudo. The testudo, the tortoise formation, is a symbol of Roman discipline. But it is more than a symbol. It is engineering turned into behavior. Front rank holds shields from shin to eye level, forming a wall. Ranks behind raise shields overhead, forming a roof. The group becomes a moving shell. Arrows strike wood and glance away. Stones bounce, spears scrape. It is not invincible, but it is terrifying, because it turns a crowd into a single, armored creature. Here's what matters. You cannot do that without the SCUTUM. Not like this. Not with small shields. Not with light bucklers. The SCUTUM's size and curvature make the formation possible, and the formation turns the shield into something bigger than itself, a system. So when you study the Dura shield, you are studying more than an artifact. You are studying the physical foundation of Rome's most famous military identity. And Dura-Europos gives us the context that makes it haunting. Because the shield's survival is tied to the final hours of a city. Dura's last phase was a desperate improvisation of defense. Buildings were swallowed into the wall. Towers were packed with earth and rubble. Everything became fortification. The SCUTUM was found in one of these reinforced areas, linked to the city's western defenses. The same defensive measures that tried to save Dura also sealed its objects into the ground. And then, after the Persian capture, the city was destroyed and abandoned. That abandonment is the second key to the shield's survival. Most cities are reused, rebuilt, looted, buried, then cut open again by later people who live on top of them. Dura was different. It became a time capsule. The moment of destruction stayed frozen because nobody came back to turn the ruins into a new life. So the SCUTUM remained in darkness for almost 2,000 years, waiting. Now, look at the implications. If Dura-Europos preserved a SCUTUM, it suggests something uncomfortable about Roman archaeology. It suggests the evidence was always there, but the conditions were rarely right. And that means our understanding of Roman equipment has been shaped by absence, by what rots away. So the Dura SCUTUM is not only a shield, it is a correction. It tells historians, you were right about the form, but you underestimated the details. Because the paint matters, the style matters, the variations matter. A Roman shield was not only an object of protection, it was a piece of visual culture. And that visual culture has a deeper meaning at Dura. Frontiers distort identity. They intensify it. A legionary on the edge of empire is far from Rome, far from the Senate, far from the monuments. So the symbols on the shield become his portable Rome, a moving banner, a handheld empire. And the motifs on the Dura SCUTUM, with victory figures and the eagle, speak directly to that need. They are not just saying win, they are saying Rome wins by nature. They are saying victory belongs to us. That is why this shield feels like propaganda you can lift. Now, there is one more layer that makes this discovery even more unsettling. The scutum from Dura-Europos is often described as the only surviving intact legionary shield, because it is the only one preserved close enough to its original structure and size to be reconstructed and studied as a whole form. But Dura also yielded many shield remains, fragments, boards, bosses, and evidence of multiple shield traditions in use. This is important because it shows something people forget. Roman military equipment was not always uniform. By the 3rd century, the empire's armies were changing. Units from different regions brought different practices. Oval shields, regionally influenced designs, and traditional scuta could exist side by side. Dura was not a neat parade of identical legionaries. It was a frontier machine adapting to reality. So the Dura scutum is both a masterpiece of Roman tradition and a glimpse into a changing military world. And that leads to the real emotional punch of this chapter. When you look at this shield, you're not looking at Rome at its center. You're looking at Rome at the edge, where everything is tested, where the empire's confidence meets someone else's strength. The shield did not survive because someone preserved it lovingly. It survived because men fought and died, because a city collapsed, because Earth sealed it away. It is a battlefield relic without a battlefield, a soldier's tool without the soldier's name. And yet, it is intensely personal, because the wear patterns, the paint, the size, the missing boss, the reconstruction scars, all of it whispers one thought that never goes away. Someone held this. Someone stood behind it. Someone trusted it. And that person never walked out of Dura-Europos. Which means this artifact is not only a survival, it is a witness. A witness to Rome's discipline, Rome's symbolism, and Rome's vulnerability. And if one shield can survive like this, sealed by disaster, what else is still buried beneath collapsed walls and forgotten frontiers, waiting for the exact conditions that allow history to resist time? Because sometimes the past doesn't vanish. Sometimes it hides. And when it returns, it doesn't just add detail, it rewrites the story. Some discoveries feel like accidents. A coin in a field, a shard of pottery in the soil, a broken blade pulled from a riverbed. You can explain those finds with normal life. But the terracotta warriors do not feel like normal life. They feel like a decision so massive, so deliberate, that it bends the idea of death itself. In 1974, farmers digging a well near Xi'an in China's Shanxi province uncovered fragments of terracotta. At first, it was just clay and confusion. Then more pieces appeared. Then a face. Then an arm. Then an entire figure, life-size, staring through thousands of years like it had been waiting for air. Soon, archaeology revealed the truth. Not one statue, but an underground military installation made of clay. A buried army. The warriors sit in 3 main pits, with evidence of a 4th pit that was never finished. They lie less than a mile from a pyramid-shaped mausoleum mound built for Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, who lived from 259 BC to 210 BC. And right away, the scale becomes the first shock. The pits contain an estimated 8,000 life-size figures. Only a portion have been excavated, but even the visible ranks are overwhelming. Infantry, cavalry, archers, charioteers, officers, and high-ranking commanders. Pit 3 is believed to have served as a command post. It contains an honor guard and a chariot that appears ceremonial, suggesting a space designed around leadership, not just combat. This is not a grave good. This is a parallel world constructed underground. And the deeper you look, the more disturbing it becomes. Because the army isn't symbolic in the way we expect ancient burial offerings to be symbolic. It is not a small figurine meant to represent protection. It is full size, full presence, full organization. It is as if the emperor didn't want a reminder of an army. He wanted the army itself. And then comes the second shock, individuality. From a distance, the terracotta warriors can look identical, like an endless grid of cloned soldiers. But up close, that illusion collapses. The faces vary. The cheekbones change. The brows tilt. The mouths tighten. Hairstyles differ. Some wear caps. Some have top knots. Some show mustaches or beards. Body types shift. Postures change. Even expressions feel distinct. This is why visitors often leave with the same strange feeling. It doesn't feel like you're looking at statues. It feels like you're meeting people. And that has led to one of the most famous theories about the warriors, that they were modeled on real soldiers from Qin Shi Huang's army. It's possible, but it's not that simple. Because the individuality may be an engineered illusion, not portraiture in the modern sense. And the reason we know that is because the warriors were stamped. Each contains marks naming foremen and workshops, a system of accountability. Mistakes could be traced. Faults could be punished. It is the kind of control system you expect from a centralized state, not a loose collection of artists. That matters because Qin Shi Huang's entire reign was a project of control. He didn't just unify China, he standardized it. Weights, measures, currency, writing, roads, administration. The Terracotta Army is built in that same spirit, a vast operation of enforced coordination, where every unit exists inside a system. But the greatest mystery begins when you look at the direction the army faces. The warriors face east, not toward the frontiers of the empire, not outward toward unknown threats. They face the territories Qin already conquered. Why? No one can answer with certainty. Some suggest topography, because the landscape shapes how pits were constructed. Others suggest symbolism, because direction can carry meaning in Chinese cosmology. But even with those explanations, the choice still feels unsettling. It implies a ruler who feared the already subdued, a ruler who imagined rebellion as the true enemy. And to understand why, you have to understand who Qin Shi Huang was before he became first emperor. He was born Ying Zheng during the Warring States period, when China was divided into rival states locked in cycles of war. The state of Qin lay to the west, and it was already expanding aggressively. When Zheng's father died in 246 BC, Zheng took the throne at age 13. Over the next decades, through campaigns and strategy, Qin devoured the other states. In 221 BC, the unification was complete, and Zheng took the title Qin Shi Huang, first emperor. It was a title that didn't just declare victory, it declared permanence. And permanence is what haunts this entire site. Because historical and archaeological evidence suggests Qin Shi Huang began preparing for the afterlife early, possibly even before unification. His mausoleum complex was not a last-minute project. It was a lifelong obsession. A second empire intended to outlast breath.
The tomb complex itself is gigantic.
Remote sensing, core sampling, and radar studies suggest a sprawling area, often described as tens of square miles of associated features. Some archaeologists suspect the unexcavated tomb could contain an entire replica of the emperor's capital, complete with palaces, offices, and waterways. Ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after Qin Shi Huang, described the tomb as filled with models of palaces and pavilions, precious stones, and rivers and seas of mercury. For a long time, mercury was treated like myth, like exaggeration. But soil tests around the mound have shown unusually high mercury levels, a detail that makes the ancient description harder to dismiss. And then there is another silence. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian covers thousands of years, and yet does not describe the Terracotta Army directly in the way you would expect. This is where things get complicated. Some scholars argue the silence is political. The Han dynasty overthrew Qin soon after the first emperor's death. Han historians served Han rulers. Praising Qin too loudly could become dangerous. The first emperor's achievements were enormous, and acknowledging them could embarrass later rulers. So silence may not mean ignorance. It may mean avoidance. Now consider what happened after Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BC. His dynasty collapsed rapidly. The tomb complex may have suffered damage. There are accounts and archaeological suggestions that at least one pit was partially burned, possibly during unrest or rebellion after his death. And this changes the emotional tone of the army, because it means the warriors may not have stood in perfect silence for long. They may have been attacked, broken, burned, looted in places. Even the underworld army was not immune to the chaos of the living. Yet enough survived to shock the modern world. Now comes the question archaeologists have wrestled with for decades. How were they made? One romantic idea says each warrior was sculpted by a single artisan, like a masterpiece repeated thousands of times. But the evidence points to something else: modular production. Think of it like an ancient assembly line. Bodies were made using molds for standardized parts. Arms, hands, torsos, legs, heads produced separately, then assembled, then modified. Archaeologists have identified limited numbers of molds for certain features, multiple types of torsos, hands, faces. The individuality appears to come from customization layered on top, attaching different eyebrows, mustaches, and subtle clay additions, carving fine lines for age, changing the tilt of eyes, adjusting cheek contours. It's controlled variation, designed to create the illusion of endless uniqueness. After firing in kilns, the figures were painted with lacquer and pigments. In early excavation photos, you can see traces of that lost brightness. But exposure to air caused much of the paint to flake and dissolve rapidly, a conservation nightmare. That is why modern excavations move slowly, because opening the past too quickly can destroy it. The warriors once carried real weapons. The wooden components decayed, but bronze spearheads, swords, and crossbow parts were found near many figures. Some were sharp enough to suggest advanced metallurgical techniques. This again points to Qin as a state that prized standardization and mass production. And then we reach the deepest layer of meaning. This army is not only meant to protect. It is meant to reproduce the structure of empire after death. Look at the organization of the pits. Pit 1 is enormous, with infantry lines and chariots arranged in battle formation. A vanguard of archers stands at the front. Behind them, heavier forces. It mirrors tactical logic: fast-range attack leading into overwhelming mass. It is the art of war turned into clay. It is strategy, fossilized underground. Pit 2 contains a more complex mix, including cavalry and different unit groupings. Pit 3 appears like a command space, the brain of the afterlife army. The very concept implies that the emperor believed war required command and hierarchy, even beyond the grave. So what was the purpose? One explanation says the warriors were literal servants for the afterlife, meant to accompany and defend the emperor. But another explanation is darker. It suggests Qin Shi Huang feared death like a rival state, and he built his afterlife like a fortress. And that makes sense when you look at the rest of his reign. He pursued immortality, according to many traditions and later accounts. He sent expeditions, sought elixirs, and obsessed over extending life. The mausoleum and its army are the architectural form of that obsession. If he could not live forever, then his rule would. Now here is the part that keeps the mystery alive. The main tomb remains largely unopened, partly because of the risk of collapse, partly because of potential booby traps described in ancient texts, but mostly because of preservation. Many artifacts could disintegrate the moment the tomb is exposed to air. The paint issues on the warriors are a warning. Open too quickly, and you lose the very evidence you came to find. So the army remains a guard force for something we still won't fully touch. And that creates a strange modern parallel. 2,000 years ago, workers built this army so the emperor could rule in darkness forever. Today, modern archaeologists hesitate to open the center of the tomb because the past is too fragile, too irreplaceable. In a way, the emperor is still controlling the pace, still deciding what we can see. And maybe that is the true power of this place. Not the scale, not the artistry, not even the army, but the fact that the heart of the complex remains sealed, like a locked room in the story of history, daring us to open it, while warning us that opening it might destroy the evidence forever. So the terracotta warriors stand in formation, facing east, guarding a tomb we still fear to disturb. And the question they leave behind is simple and terrifying. If the emperor was willing to bury an empire under the ground, what did he bury in the center that we are still not ready to face? Some objects do not fit the story they are supposed to belong to. They look familiar, but the timeline refuses to cooperate. The Bronze Age horned helmets of Denmark are one of those objects. For centuries, horned helmets have lived in popular imagination as Viking symbols. Operas, illustrations, fantasy art all helped cement that image. But archaeology has been slowly dismantling it, and when the soil of Denmark finally spoke clearly, it said something far stranger than anyone expected. In 1942, during the middle of World War II, a peat cutter working in a bog on the Danish island of Zealand, near the village of Vexe, struck metal. Not a weapon, not a tool, a curved bronze form, and then another. What emerged were two horned helmets, placed together, resting on what appeared to be a wooden platform. They were theatrical, almost unreal. Each helmet featured long, sweeping bull horns extending from a rounded bronze cap. The front bore large eyes and a beak shaped like a bird of prey. At the back, fittings suggested that feathers or horsehair once formed a mane. They did not look like battlefield equipment. They looked like ritual authority made wearable. At first, popular culture rushed to claim them as Viking artifacts. Horns meant Vikings. The story felt too neat to question. But scholars were cautious, and time would prove them right. These helmets were not medieval. They were ancient. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed their deposition around 900 BC, nearly 3,000 years ago, deep in the Nordic Bronze Age. That date alone was enough to force a rewrite. The Vikings were not only innocent, they were latecomers. But the date was only the beginning of the problem, because once the helmets were understood in their proper era, a deeper question emerged. Where did the idea come from? Bronze Age Scandinavia was not isolated. It was connected through trade networks that moved amber, copper, tin, and prestige goods across Europe. But horned helmets of this exact form were not known elsewhere in Northern Europe, until researchers began looking south. In Sardinia, in western Iberia, and in parts of the Mediterranean world, Bronze Age rock art and small bronze figurines depict warriors wearing helmets with long, curved horns. The visual similarities were difficult to ignore. Same sweeping horn shapes, same ritual posture, same suggestion of animal power fused with human authority. And that is where the theory appeared. Some archaeologists proposed that these Danish helmets were influenced by Sardinian symbolism, carried north through long-distance trade routes that followed the Atlantic coast. If true, it would suggest that ideas, not just metals, traveled from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia around 3,000 years ago. It would imply a level of prehistoric connectivity that feels almost uncomfortable. To support the theory, researchers looked closely at the helmets themselves. In 2019, organic residue was identified inside one of the hollow horns. Birch tar, likely used as an adhesive or binding material. This residue could be radiocarbon dated, and it confirmed the Bronze Age timeline. The dating was solid. The interpretation was not. Because archaeology does not accept visual similarity alone. Similar shapes do not always mean shared origins. Human cultures independently invent similar symbols again and again. Horns, especially, are a universal symbol of strength, fertility, dominance, and divine power. Bulls appear everywhere. Birds of prey appear everywhere. So critics pushed back. They asked a simple question. If Mediterranean traders carried horned helmet symbolism along the Atlantic coast to Scandinavia, where is the evidence in between? Where are the horned helmets in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, or Britain? If such a route existed and was active enough to transmit complex religious symbolism, why does the trail appear to vanish for thousands of kilometers? That absence is the fracture line in the debate. Supporters argue that ritual objects are rare by nature, that deposition practices differed, that organic components vanished, that not finding evidence is not proof of absence. Skeptics respond that archaeology cannot be built on missing bridges. If the route existed, something should have survived. A fragment, a depiction, a partial imitation? So far, nothing has. This turns the helmets into something dangerous for interpretation. They sit right on the edge between possibility and projection. And this is where the story becomes less about trade routes and more about power. Because regardless of where the idea came from, the helmets were not made for war. The bronze is thin. The horns are impractical. The visibility would be poor. The weight distribution would be awkward. Any serious combat would destroy them. Everything about these helmets points to ritual use. Which raises the question, who wore them? Most scholars agree they were likely used by an elite class, possibly rulers or priest-kings during ceremonial performances. The helmets combine multiple animal symbols. The horns evoke the bull, a symbol of strength and fertility. The bird imagery suggests a raptor, a creature associated with the sky, vision, and divine oversight. The horsehair, or feathered mane, adds motion and presence. This is not protection. This is transformation. The wearer does not look human anymore. He becomes something between animal, god, and ruler. And that matters because around 1000 BC, Scandinavian societies were undergoing significant changes. Power was consolidating. Social hierarchies were becoming more rigid. Ritual landscapes were being formalized. Solar worship, which had dominated earlier Bronze Age religion, began to blend with animal symbolism. The horned helmets appear precisely at that moment. They may represent rulers legitimizing their authority through divine imagery. Wearing the divine to rule the human. Seen this way, the Mediterranean connection becomes less important than the function. Power everywhere dresses itself the same way. It reaches for the animal. It reaches for the sky. It reaches for symbols older than writing. And yet, the controversy refuses to fade. Because if even one fragment of a horned helmet were found tomorrow in coastal France or Iberia, the entire debate would shift overnight. A single discovery could connect Scandinavia to Sardinia across the sea, rewriting Bronze Age Europe as a world far more interconnected than we imagined. Until then, the helmets remain suspended between two realities. In one, they are evidence of long-distance Atlantic exchange, a forgotten maritime highway where ideas traveled with traders and metals. In the other, they are an independent expression of power, born locally, using symbols that feel universal because human imagination often arrives at the same solutions. And this tension is exactly why these helmets matter. They show how easily archaeology can slide from evidence into narrative, how tempting it is to connect dots that feel meaningful, how careful we must be when the story is beautiful. Because history does not reward beauty, it rewards patience. The Vexu helmets were placed deliberately in a bog, likely as offerings. Waterlogged landscapes were sacred spaces in northern Europe. Depositing powerful objects into bogs was a way of removing them from the human world and giving them to something else. That act alone tells us everything we need to know about their importance. They were not discarded, they were surrendered. And whatever belief system demanded that surrender is now gone. All that remains are two bronze helmets that still refuse to explain themselves fully. They do not confirm a lost trade route. They do not deny it either. They simply exist, ancient, dramatic, and uncomfortable. And they remind us of something archaeology rarely admits out loud. Sometimes the most dangerous artifact is the one that almost makes sense, because it tempts us to finish the story for it. Some discoveries become famous because they answer questions. Others become famous because they refuse to settle them. The Golden Man of Kazakhstan belongs firmly in the second category. In 1969, near the town of Issyk, about 60 kilometers east of modern Almaty, construction work disturbed an ancient burial mound, a kurgan, rising quietly from the steppe. What followed was not a dramatic, carefully planned excavation, but a hurried response to an unexpected find. Archaeologists were called in quickly, knowing that looting and destruction were real risks. Inside the mound, the central burial had already been plundered in antiquity. Whatever lay there had been taken long ago. But to one side of the mound, hidden from ancient robbers, the excavators uncovered something extraordinary. A human skeleton laid within a wooden sarcophagus made of massive fir logs, completely covered in gold. More than 4,000 gold ornaments, plaques, studs, appliques, all sewn or fixed onto clothing that had long since decayed, leaving the gold to trace the outline of a body that once moved, fought, or ruled. The impact was immediate. The discovery was hailed as one of the most important archaeological finds in Central Asia. The individual was quickly nicknamed the Golden Man, and later, more dramatically, the Tutankhamun of Kazakhstan. It was an understandable comparison. Like Tutankhamun, this burial was rich, visually overwhelming, and unexpectedly intact. But the comparison also carried a subtle assumption that the person inside was male. At first, no one seriously questioned it. The costume looked martial. The figure wore a high, conical headdress, rising nearly 70 centimeters, decorated with gold arrows pointing skyward. Snow leopards snarled from the surface. A two-headed, winged mythical creature spread across the crown. The body was clad in gold-covered garments, boots, and ornaments that suggested status, power, and authority. This looked like a warrior. And in the 20th century, warriors were assumed to be men. But archaeology has a way of punishing assumptions. The burial dates to roughly the 5th century BC, during the Saka period, a culture closely related to the Scythian world of the Eurasian steppe. These societies were nomadic or semi-nomadic, highly mobile, and deeply invested in animal symbolism, gold craftsmanship, and elite display. The gold itself was masterfully worked. Techniques included battering, stamping, carving, and granulation. The motifs were not decorative filler, they were a language. Snow leopards, deer, birds, horses, and hybrid beasts all appear repeatedly in Saka art, forming a visual system tied to cosmology, power, and the natural world. This suit was not just clothing, it was a statement. Soon after the discovery, the Golden Man was embraced as a national symbol. When Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991, the figure became an icon of heritage and continuity. Replicas appeared atop monuments in cities like Almaty and Astana. The Golden Man appeared on coins, emblems, and the presidential standard. The message was clear. Kazakhstan's roots were ancient, powerful, and sovereign. But beneath the gold, a problem was quietly growing. The skeleton itself had been badly neglected. In the rush to celebrate the gold, the human remains received far less care. Reports later revealed that the bones were stored improperly for decades, even placed in a cardboard box with a handwritten label. Exposure to bacteria, humidity, and time degraded them further. When researchers later tried to reassess the remains, they found that making a confident biological sex determination was extremely difficult. And then, scholars began to look more closely at the grave goods. Alongside the gold costume, archaeologists found items that did not fit neatly into the image of a male warrior. There was a mirror, beads, tools associated with textile production, such as a spindle or spinning-related object, a scoop. Objects that, in many archaeological traditions, are more commonly associated with women's burials. This alone does not prove anything. Gender roles vary across cultures. Objects do not carry universal meanings, but the pattern was enough to raise questions. In 2002, archaeologist Janine Davis Kimball published a provocative argument suggesting that the Golden Man may in fact have been a woman. Not just any woman, a priestess warrior. According to this interpretation, the towering headdress takes on a different meaning. Rather than a purely martial helmet, it could represent fertility, cosmic order, or ritual authority. The upward-pointing gold elements may symbolize branches, growth, or a connection between earth and sky. In steppe traditions, such symbolism often belonged to ritual specialists, not battlefield commanders. Davis Kimball also pointed to parallels in other Scythian and Saka burials across the Eurasian steppe. including graves in the southern Urals that contained armed women buried with weapons and high-status items. These finds have reshaped how scholars understand gender and power in steppe societies. Women could fight. Women could rule. Women could hold ritual authority. If the Issyk burial belonged to a woman, then the Golden Man would become something far more complicated. Not just a warrior, but a convergence of political, spiritual, and symbolic power. And that possibility made many people uncomfortable. Because by the time the debate gained traction, the Golden Man had already been transformed into a national emblem. Statues do not like ambiguity. Flags do not like footnotes. Nations prefer symbols that speak clearly, not ones that raise questions. So the idea of a golden woman remained marginal, discussed in academic circles, but rarely reflected in public monuments or official narratives. There is another layer that deepens the unease. Some researchers have speculated about a connection between the Issyk burial and legendary figures like Tomyris, the queen of the Massagetae, who famously defeated the Persian king Cyrus the Great. While there is no direct evidence linking the Golden Man to Tomyris, the temptation to connect a richly buried steppe warrior to a powerful female ruler reveals something important. We are still negotiating how comfortable we are with female power in the ancient past. The Golden Man sits exactly at that fault line. Whoever the individual was, male or female, young or old, warrior or priest, the burial speaks of extraordinary status. This was not a common soldier. This was someone whose death required immense resources, skilled artisans, and a symbolic language powerful enough to justify covering a human body in gold. And yet, the identity of that body remains uncertain. That uncertainty has not stopped the Golden Man from becoming one of the most recognizable archaeological symbols in Central Asia. It has simply been pushed aside. Which raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does archaeology stop being about the past and start becoming about the present? The Golden Man of Kazakhstan is a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship. It reveals the sophistication of Saka goldworking, the symbolic depth of steppe cultures, and the importance of ritualized dress as a form of authority. But it also reveals something about us. Our need to decide. Our need to label. Our discomfort with ambiguity. The bones, damaged and poorly preserved, may never give a clear answer. DNA analysis is difficult. The context is compromised. The evidence remains incomplete. So the Golden Man stands, brilliant and silent, wearing 4,000 pieces of gold, while the question beneath the costume remains unanswered. Not who was this person, but why are we so afraid to let the answer be complicated? Because sometimes, the most revealing part of an ancient artifact is not what it tells us about the past. It is what it exposes about the stories we still want to tell today. Most ancient artifacts speak to us from a distance. Armor suggests battles. Weapons suggest violence. Monuments suggest power. But sometimes the most unsettling connection to the past comes from something ordinary, something worn, something shaped by a human body day after day. A shoe. At Magna, also known as Carvorin, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, archaeologists uncovered a collection of leather shoes preserved in waterlogged defensive ditches. This alone was not unusual. Vindolanda, only a short distance away, has produced thousands of Roman shoes, from infant footwear to military boots. Leather survives there because the soil is wet, anaerobic, and unforgiving to oxygen. What shocked the researchers at Magna was not the preservation. it was the size. Out of 32 shoes recovered from the northern defensive ditches, roughly a quarter measured more than 30 centimeters in length. One sole reached an extraordinary 32.6 centimeters, the largest ever recorded in the Vindolanda Trust's massive footwear collection. To put that into perspective, fewer than 1% of Vindolanda's measurable shoes exceed 30 centimeters. At Magna, these oversized shoes were not rare. They were a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. The shoes were found at the base of deep defensive ditches known as ankle breakers. These trenches were designed to trip attackers, injure legs, and slow assaults on the fort. Over time, they filled with water, organic debris, and discarded or lost objects. The lack of oxygen preserved leather that would normally rot away within years. This preservation gives us something rare in archaeology, a direct physical trace of bodies that rarely leave skeletons in good condition. Shoes record size, weight, gait, wear patterns, repairs. They tell us how people moved, how long they walked, and how they adapted to terrain. So when archaeologists saw these massive soles, the question became unavoidable. Who was wearing them? One tempting explanation is simple. These were big men. Roman forts along Hadrian's Wall housed a diverse mix of troops. Magna itself predates the wall and was part of the Steingate frontier system. Over time, it housed soldiers from many regions of the empire: Syrian archers, Batavians from the Low Countries, Dalmatians, legionaries from established Roman units. Different populations have different average body sizes. If Magna hosted a higher proportion of recruits from regions where people tended to be taller or heavier, larger shoes would follow naturally. But there is another possibility. The shoes may reflect not just physical variation, but specialization. Heavy infantry, soldiers tasked with carrying armor, shields, and weapons for long hours, may have favored thicker soles and larger footwear. Roman shoes often consisted of multiple layers of leather held together with stitching, thongs, and hobnails. The hobnails provided traction and durability, especially on muddy ground. A larger shoe spreads weight more evenly. It offers stability. It reduces fatigue. In other words, shoe size might reflect role as much as body. But here is where the story becomes more human. A shoe is personal in a way armor is not. Armor can be issued. Shields can be standardized. Shoes mold themselves to feet. They crease where toes bend. They wear thin where a heel strikes. They carry the shape of a life. One of the archaeologists involved in the Magna excavations described the emotional weight of lifting a shoe from the mud. Unlike a weapon, it immediately suggests the person who wore it. It invites you to imagine them standing watch in the cold rain, pacing the wall, or trudging through mud on patrol. And that is why these shoes matter. They force us to confront the Roman Empire not as an abstract machine, but as a collection of bodies. Tall bodies, short bodies, young bodies, worn bodies. The Roman army is often described as standardized and uniform, but Magna reminds us that uniformity was an ideal, not a reality. Equipment varied. People varied. The empire adapted constantly to whoever was available to hold its borders. And those borders were not comfortable places. Hadrian's Wall and the forts around it were cold, wet, and remote. Soldiers stationed there were far from Rome, far from family, far from the marble and warmth of the Mediterranean world. Their shoes were their interface with that harsh landscape. Which brings us to a quieter but more urgent issue. These finds are under threat. Leather survives at sites like Magna and Vindolanda because groundwater levels remain high. Oxygen is excluded. Bacteria are slowed. But climate change is altering that balance. Drier conditions lower water tables. Soil oxygen increases. Organic materials decay rapidly. Archaeologists working at Magna have warned that unusually dry seasons are already affecting preservation. Finds that would have survived for centuries longer may now deteriorate within years. So these shoes are not only a window into the Roman past, they are a countdown. The giant shoes of Magna challenge another quiet assumption: that ancient soldiers were physically small by modern standards. While average heights may indeed have been lower in some periods, the Magna footwear suggests a range that included individuals of considerable size. The Roman army did not select one body type. It selected effectiveness. Strength mattered. Endurance mattered. Presence mattered. And those qualities leave traces in leather. There is no inscription telling us the name of the soldier who wore the largest shoe. No monument records his service. No grave marks his resting place. But the shoe remains, shaped by his weight, his movement, his days on the frontier. That is a different kind of history. Not the history of emperors or battles, but the history of pressure, friction, and routine. The history of standing, walking, waiting. And that is what makes this chapter quietly powerful, because it reminds us that empires are not held together by grand strategy alone. They are held together by feet on the ground, by people who stood in places they did not choose, wearing equipment they depended on, leaving behind objects that feel ordinary until time turns them into witnesses. The Magna shoes do not tell us who conquered Britain. They tell us who stayed there. And sometimes, that matters more. Some objects were made to be used, others were made to be seen, and a rare few were made to be given away. The Battersea Shield belongs to the last category. It is one of the most famous pieces of Celtic art ever discovered in Britain, not because it changed warfare, but because it changes how we understand why objects of war existed at all. In the mid-19th century, during construction work for the predecessor of Chelsea Bridge in London, workers dredging the River Thames pulled something extraordinary from the mud: a large, ornate bronze sheet, curved and decorated with spirals, circles, and vivid red enamel studs. It was immediately clear that this was not an ordinary object. What they had found was the bronze facing of a shield, now known as the Battersea Shield, dated broadly to the Iron Age, roughly between 350 and 50 BC. The wooden core that once gave it strength had long since vanished, leaving only the delicate metal skin behind. And that absence tells us everything. Because once archaeologists examined the object closely, a strange truth emerged. This shield could not have worked in battle. The bronze sheet is too thin, too fragile, too short to protect a body effectively. One heavy blow would have damaged it. One serious engagement would have ruined it. This was not something you carried into a fight expecting to survive. So why make it at all? The answer lies in how Iron Age societies understood power. The Battersea Shield is decorated in the Latin style, a distinctly Celtic artistic tradition characterized by flowing curves, spirals, and abstract geometry. The designs were created using repoussé, a technique where the metal is hammered from behind to create raised relief on the front. The effect is subtle, elegant, and intensely controlled. 27 red glass enamel studs are set into the surface, arranged in 4 different sizes, with the largest clustered near the central boss. Even the handle was decorated, something that makes little sense for a battlefield object, but perfect sense for a ritual one. This shield was not designed to stop weapons. It was designed to communicate. In the Iron Age world of Britain, rivers were not just waterways. They were boundaries between worlds, sacred spaces, places where offerings were made to gods, spirits, or forces that governed fate, fertility, and victory. Across Europe, archaeologists have found swords, spears, shields, and even human remains deliberately placed in rivers, lakes, and bogs. These were not accidents. They were sacrifices. To give up a valuable object was to make a statement of power, wealth, and belief. Only someone with status could afford to surrender such an item. Only someone confident in divine favor would dare to give it away. The Battersea Shield fits perfectly into that tradition. It was likely created not for war, but for ceremony. A display piece, carried in ritual processions, used to project authority, identity, and divine connection. And then, at the right moment, it was offered to the river, thrown into the Thames, not lost, not dropped, given. This interpretation gains weight when we consider the context of the find. In the same stretch of the Thames, large quantities of Roman and Celtic weapons have been recovered, along with human skulls. The river was not neutral ground. It was a place of repeated ritual action. The shield's beauty was not a contradiction to its purpose. It was the purpose. Because in many ancient cultures, the value of a sacrifice was measured by how painful it was to give up. A simple weapon meant little. An ornate object, carefully crafted by skilled artisans, carried meaning. To offer such an object was to show devotion, to prove legitimacy, to negotiate with forces beyond human control. So the Battersea Shield represents a different kind of power than the armor we have seen in earlier chapters. The Dendra Panoply protected the body. Philip's cuirass projected royal authority. The Roman SCUTUM enforced discipline. The Terracotta Army extended rule beyond death. The horned helmets transformed rulers into gods. The Golden Man blurred identity and power. The Magna shoes grounded empire in bodies. And the Battersea Shield does something else entirely. It abandons protection. It accepts vulnerability. It says that power does not always come from holding on. Sometimes it comes from letting go. This brings us to the end of the journey. Across 3,000 years, across continents, across cultures that never met, one pattern keeps repeating. Military objects are never just military. They are stories shaped into material. They are belief systems hammered into metal. They are politics worn on the body. They are fear and hope given form. And when these objects are buried, sealed, abandoned, or sacrificed, it is never random. Someone made a choice. The Mycenaean elite sealed armor into tombs to carry status into death. Macedonian kings dressed themselves in symbols to rule even in memory. Roman soldiers carried painted shields to remind themselves who they served. Chinese emperors buried armies to command eternity. Bronze Age rulers wore animal power to legitimize rule. Steppe elites covered bodies in gold to transcend identity. Frontier soldiers left shoes in the mud, unnoticed but essential. And Celtic leaders gave away beauty to forces they believed controlled the world. These objects survived not because time was kind. They survived because humans decided they mattered enough to remove them from ordinary life. And that is why they still speak. When we look at ancient warfare, we often focus on how people fought. But the deeper truth lies elsewhere. It lies in what people chose to protect, what they chose to display, what they chose to bury, and what they chose to surrender. Because in the end, the most powerful weapon in history was never a sword or a shield. It was belief. and belief leaves traces long after the battles are forgotten. The more we uncover these objects, the more one thing becomes clear. The past was not simpler. It was just quieter. And now, piece by piece, it is speaking again.